London School of Economics and Oxford University with the creation of a yearly commission on state fragility, growth and development comes to an end this month of June. The work the commission has done is quite tremendous, and it has been examining what state fragility, its consequences and manifestations are as we see in the world today. So, last March, the commission published its report, which was quite chilling on the state of our countries in the world today. So, what is state fragility and just how far has it impacted our daily lives? My guest today on GLOBEWATCH is the co-chair of that commission, headed by the former British Prime Minister David Cameron. He happens to be a former governor of Rwanda to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the former Rwandan Minister of Finance, the former president of the African Development Bank, and currently serves as the AU Special Envoy for its Peace Fund, and equally co-chairs the Commission on State Fragility, Growth and Development under the auspices of the International Growth Center. What is it all about? Donna Kaberuka, welcome to GLOBEWATCH.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Fundamentally, what should my viewers in Mogadishu, in Islamabad, in Yaoundé understand as state fragility?
Thank you. Before I come to that point, I want to say that in the last 20 years, the division between rich countries and low-income countries has narrowed significantly, but we still have 1 billion people in poverty, but largely because of the number of people living in the countries affected by fragility and conflict. And we still estimate that by 2030, probably up to 30% of population in the world will be living in countries affected by fragility. I want to make sure that we understand that fragility is not the same thing as conflict. Conflict can lead to fragility, it does. But a country like Haiti is considered very fragile, but it has never had a conflict, an armed conflict at least.
Because of natural disasters?
There are many environmental issues, political issues, which lead to the state being unable to fulfill its responsibilities. I also want to make sure that we understand the difference between fragile states and failed states. It's not the same thing. Now, we at the Commission, we're looking at the conditions which make countries recover from fragility and what the international community can do about it, because the approaches so far don't seem to have worked. Now, with the extent of fragility now from the Middle East to Yemen, to Libya, to the Sahel, to many other places in Southwest Asia, we need to find out new ways of addressing those countries. And this is what we have done.
You were given a yearly mandate by the London School of Economics and Oxford University. I just wonder, your mission will be ending this June. What principally are you bringing in tackling global problems?
I would say there were three, perhaps, very fundamental findings. Because up to now, when a state is trying to emerge from fragility or conflict, we have thought that money was always a problem, or that money alone can deliver the outcomes. And that has always been accompanied by a set of preconditions for what these countries should do to recover from fragility. And thirdly, the people of the country have always been behind rather than in front. So let me pick up the question about money. Of course, when you help a country to recover from fragility, you need a lot of resources. But resources on their own cannot deliver recovery. And indeed, many of these fragile states are fragile because of fight over rent, over natural resources. Indeed, a country like Libya, which exports at full production close to 2 million barrels per day, does not need money for its reconstruction. But it is a fragile state, and fragility from Libya has spread out in neighboring countries. So we need to do something different. And the first thing we have to do is to let the people of the country take the lead. Take the lead. Maybe the kind of institutions they build may not be perfect, may not resemble the institutions in Denmark, but they'll be the institutions for which they themselves have built consensus around. Often we have rushed into trying to impose Western-style institutions very early, when the countries are not ready, when they're still building consensus. The second thing I want to say is the role of business. Because far too often, recovery from fragility has been made to be an issue of states. But you know, look at Somalia, which has been in fragility or even a failing state for the last 35 years. What has kept Somalia going are the business people and the money coming from abroad, from the diaspora. So we do think that in the future, instead of having these conferences on peace and stabilization, where you have government and donors, we need to have government and businesses who have a stake in the country, and then other compositions of society. And finally, this is quite important. When you have got a fragile situation, or what you call fragile states, it rarely ever stays within the boundaries of that country. There'll be spillovers, whether it's refugees, small arms, migrants, even terrorist groups, drug, and so on. It is important that you look at fragility as a regional issue, not a state issue. That is why we don't use the word fragile states. We use the word fragility. So to resume, it is important because millions of people are affected. It is important because the approaches so far have not worked. And it is important because we need to get it right.
You have received roughly 1,219 applications to fund projects in areas suffering from fragility. 323 roughly have been funded. Your funding gap is between 5,000 to 50,000 pounds. We are here in Ethiopia, one of the countries you are providing assistance. Just give me a sense of the elements that are taken into consideration for funding to be made available.
No, I think that's probably a misunderstanding. But when I was president of the African Development Bank, we had a ring-fenced facility of $1.6 billion, which I think is still there, to fund countries which, under some metrics, qualify as fragile states. Now, the approaches are quite simple. For example, we look at how fast GDP has declined in a given set of time. We look at the number of human development indicators. We look at the number of governance indicators and an estimation of spillover effects. And then we estimate what it takes to rebuild the basic institutions, what it takes maybe to help the country normalize its relationship with the international financial community, and then probably what it takes for them to kickstart some key infrastructure. Now, we have learned some lessons, some of which have fed into the work of the Commission I've been co-chairing.
You are involved in providing assistance in roughly 16 countries. Why? Ethiopia, Pakistan, Somalia, India.
Some of those you're mentioning are not fragile states, but they might be having a fragility in some parts of the areas, like you have in northern Chad, northern Nigeria, or northern Cameroon, where we have this Boko Haram terrorists, or parts of the Sahel. So the funding is very much geared to the nature of the problem. It does not mean that the country in which you are operating has large elements of fragility.
Last March, you produced your report, Escaping Fragility. Just give my audience a sense. It was quite chilling. I watched the former British Prime Minister David Cameron explaining the nitty-gritties of that on CNN with Christiana Mampu. What was really the content?
But this is what I'm saying to you. Millions of people are trapped in fragility. So as the rest of the world is moving on, they are trapped. And I'm suggesting to you that the approaches so far have focused largely on mobilizing money. But we now think that money is only part of the solution. So the question was, what are the elements of the package? And I'd mentioned some to you. We have underestimated the role of business. We have underestimated the role of communities. We have underestimated the role of faith-based organizations. And so we feel that in the future, there should be a large consensus around what it takes to rebuild the country. And thirdly, equally important, the people of the country must take the lead. And they should not be given preconditions or conditionalities which resemble those of Western institutions, which took a long, long time to build. And may I remind you that Europe, after World War II, was basically a condition of fragility. It escaped the fragility because of assistance from some of the Allied powers, especially the USA.
The Marshall Plan.
Among other things. Yeah. It took over 10 years. Yeah. And then institutions were rebuilt, infrastructure was rebuilt. So fragility is not an African speciality. I wanted to caution that. Okay. There's a tendency to confuse fragility with other African specific problems.
We'll be working out of this issue to talk one or two issues before we separate in a moment. The last question on this issue of the Commission on Fragility, Growth and Development. How do you square in development? One of your statistics at the Commission's website indicates that roughly 65 million people have been displaced in the world since 1945. That should be the largest number, including 11 million Syrians. How do you go all about handling issues of immigration, injecting that with developmental issues?
No, I think you're mixing up a couple of issues which are unrelated. Number one, it is true that we have now the highest number of refugees and internally displaced people since 1945. But largely because of the crisis in the Middle East and its spillovers. I'm referring to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and then the extension into the Sahelian region. Now, the solution to that is largely geopolitical. Geopolitical in the sense that it's not a country, it's not a solution which only one country can provide. But I think you are confusing refugees, IDPs, and migrants. Migrants is something else. And migrants migrate for many reasons. As the president of Ghana said, in the 19th century, migrants were mainly from Italy, Ireland, going to the Americas or other parts of Europe. Migration has been part of human movement in this and the last century. We're talking about refugees, IDPs. These are what falls within the category which we're discussing. Okay.
Now, you are not only part of that commission which you co-chair with David Cameron, but you are equally AU envoy for its peace fund. When you were at the African Development Bank, you had a quite remarkable record. You took the turnover from 30 to 100 billion. You succeeded to take the annual funding to about $12 billion. That shows your capacity in resources mobilization. What have you been able to put together in this peace fund?
Thank you for your kind remarks, but it is not the same thing because mobilizing money for a bank or capital for a bank is not the same as mobilizing money for peace-related operations. When you mobilize money for a bank, there will be a return, you pay back, and so on. But in this case of peace, it is about what does it take for African Union to have the means to prevent conflicts? Because that is the most important component. And the EU spends anything around $40 million a year, okay, to prevent conflicts. Because if you don't prevent conflict, then you have to actually do peace stabilization or peacekeeping, which is extremely costly and expensive. over $1 billion per year, even more, for those expensive missions. So the idea is to give the AU means which they can use to prevent conflicts happening before you go to the step of having to do peace stabilization. I think Phase A has been a hugely successful operation. 70% of the money we wanted to raise for year one have been raised. I'm confident that before the summit in Nouakchott, we could go up to 90%, because each year we have got a target until we reach an endowment
Can we have a quantitative figure?
Until we reach $400 million in 2021. So, idea was, over a 5-year period, we build an endowment of $420 million. So each year, the aim was to raise anywhere between $50 and $60 million every year. And as I speak with you, we have about $45 million, which is very close to our target. And I'm confident before Nouakchott, we'll be able to do so. If we have the same success in the second year, in the third year, and the fourth year, I have no doubt the endowment will be raised. Then we'll have to worry about how we manage this money, how you invest it, how you ensure governance, and all those things are under discussion by the competent organs.
Just how much support do you enjoy with development partners in realizing this goal?
Peace in the world is not an issue for Africa alone. Peace is a global public good, as you know very well. So we're talking to the international community, especially the United Nations, because we are members of the United Nations. We're entitled to access resources of the UN, especially UN peacekeeping, when there are peacekeeping missions in Africa. So we're looking at how to find an articulation between the African Union and UN funding peace activities, and how to get together we can work. So that is mainly the focus of the conversation.
Let's work with one or two questions. You are the former finance minister of Rwanda, a country which has succeeded to really jumpstart its economy in roughly 20 years after the events of 1994 that all of us know. When you hear today of the Continental Free Trade Area, what does it instill to you as a former banquier, as they will say in French, as a former banker, somebody in the financial services?
It is not simply for finance ministers, it is for every African citizen, because you know, the choice the forefathers made at independence was to recognize the borders as left behind by colonial powers, even though they knew that individually these markets were very small. But they took a second decision that at some point we need to accelerate regional integration to a free trade area, eventually to a customs union, a monetary union, and an economic union. So this is a step to ensure that although our countries are politically sovereign independent, that together we have this large economic space, which will increase opportunities for business, for consumers, for producers, attract investments, and by make Africa a prosperous country. Now, the CFTA deals with tariffs. But tariffs are only half the problem. We'll have to do with other issues, non-tariff restrictions, movement of people, harmonizing policies, payments, and so on. So this is the beginning of a long journey of making the single market in Africa a possibility.
Well, as a Rwandan, I just wonder to know just how proud are you that the penning process took place in your capital, Kigali? Were you at that ceremony? I
think as a Rwandan, I was very proud, of course. But every African was very proud because this was an achievement for all of us, for all Africans. I'm glad it took place in my country because my president is now the chair of the African Union.
President Paul Kagame.
Yes, and he has put a lot of effort into ensuring that the African promise is realized. He's leading on African reforms. And the CFTA is quite a critical part of these reforms. So think if you can succeed on CFTA, movement of people, financing.
Can we have a sense of how much?
This will be quite a movement on the reform process, which will be remembered for a long time.
Can we have an idea from you, somebody who masters the inner circles of the economic systems so well, just how much it will be adding to the African economy, where most of these barriers must have gone when we have a common sky space, when we have...
It will depend what happens. You can't put a number. It depends what happens and how many countries actually effectively implement it. It depends upon what happens to non-tariff restrictions again. So I cannot put a number. I have seen numbers out in the space, but one will have to be careful to be able to monitor it on a yearly basis. I've seen figures ranging from $30 billion to our economies. But the only thing I could say to you is this, is that at the moment, we're looking at ways of funding our own activities. And we're looking at ways of raising additional revenues. You raise additional revenues from additional production productivity. Sure. And you think the room in there is anywhere between 3 and 5% of GDP. That would be quite a lot. But I think how much will we gain from tariff reduction? As I say, I've seen a lot of numbers out there, but we need to wait and see how many countries actually sign and how many NTBs remain a problem.
Finally, what will be your word for the African economy today, as you see it moving from a petroleum-dependent one, especially for countries like Nigeria, Angola, and whatsoever, as diversification increasingly enters into the economic mantle? What is your appreciation of that?
First of all, two things on oil. I think the oil market at $65 a barrel is not a bad price at all. 10 years ago, this price was below 40. And 10 years later, it was below 20. So $65 is fine. It is how you plan your investments and how you plan your expenditures. So the last 6 years was difficult for some of them, but I think it is a matter of how you plan your expenditures and how you mobilize non-oil revenues. Second, I should mention to you that many African countries actually are net importers of oil. So each time oil prices have gone up, that is pressure on the balance of payments, pressure on the currencies. So you have to look at both sides of the equation. The last few years have been difficult, but I think since maybe the last 24 months, I see recovery in Nigeria, stabilization of currency. I see recovery in South Africa. These are two large economies, accounting for about 50% of all the GDP in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think I'm bullish, but it requires that we do quite a lot of work on economic reforms, both on revenue and expenditure, on the structural side, but also on reducing dependency on natural resources. And this is what the CFTA is trying to achieve.
Thank you very much indeed, the former Rwandan Finance Minister, the former President of the African Development Bank, now co-chair of the Commission on Fragility, Growth and Development, and equally AU Envoy for its Peace Fund. Thank you very much indeed for talking once more to GLOBEWATch. The first time we had our interview was in Yaoundé back in 2016.
My pleasure.
Thank you.